India, a global powerhouse in trade, politics, and diplomacy, is facing protests in several countries in 2025. These demonstrations stem from a mix of geopolitical tensions, religious issues, and economic concerns, putting India's international relations under pressure. From the Maldives, where nationalists oppose India's military presence, to Qatar and Saudi Arabia, where religious tensions fuel public outrage, various nations are expressing dissent. Even Canada and the U.S. have seen protests over political and trade disputes. These movements highlight growing challenges in India's foreign relations, despite its strong global influence. In this video, we'll explore the 10 countries where protests against India are making headlines, analyzing their causes and potential impact on India's global standing. Stay with us as we break down the key issues driving these demonstrations and what they mean for India's future on the world stage. Let's dive in. 10. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has witnessed widespread protests against India in 2025, mainly due to continued concerns over religious intolerance. The initial outrage began in 2022 after offensive remarks about Prophet Muhammad by BJP members, leading to strong diplomatic reactions from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations. Since then, tensions have resurfaced periodically, with fresh protests erupting in Riyadh, Jeddah, and Mecca as reports of discrimination against Indian Muslims continue to emerge. Religious leaders in Saudi Arabia have publicly condemned India's treatment of its Muslim population, urging the Indian government to address the growing concerns. Saudi Arabia is one of India's largest trading partners, particularly in oil and energy. Millions of Indian expatriates live and work in the kingdom, contributing significantly to its economy. However, the protests and diplomatic strains have led to discussions about limiting India's access to Saudi markets and investments. The Saudi government has issued warnings to India, emphasizing the importance of religious harmony in maintaining strong bilateral relations. Social media campaigns have also called for a boycott of Indian products, putting pressure on Indian businesses operating in the Gulf. Despite these challenges, India and Saudi Arabia continue high-level diplomatic engagements to mitigate tensions. However, the protests serve as a reminder that religious sensitivities remain a crucial factor in India's foreign relations with the Gulf region. If India fails to address these concerns, its long-standing economic and strategic ties with Saudi Arabia could face significant challenges in the coming years. 9. Iran. Iran has been vocal in its criticism of India, particularly regarding religious tensions and the treatment of minorities. The controversy surrounding Islamophobic remarks made by BJP politicians in 2022 still lingers, with fresh protests erupting in Tehran and other cities in 2025. Iranian clerics and political leaders have condemned India for its handling of religious issues, urging the Modi government to take action against rising anti-Muslim sentiments. Protesters in Iran have gathered outside the Indian embassy, burning effigies and demanding a stronger response from the Indian government. Despite these tensions, India and Iran share strategic economic and geopolitical interests. Iran plays a key role in India's energy security, providing crude oil at competitive prices. Additionally, India has invested in the Chabahar port project, which serves as a crucial trade link between India, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. However, protests and diplomatic disagreements have complicated these ties. Iran's supreme leader has also criticized India's domestic policies, further straining relations. While trade continues, the protests reflect growing frustration among Iranian citizens over India's stance on religious issues. If tensions escalate, Iran could impose diplomatic or economic restrictions, potentially affecting India's energy security and regional trade ambitions. The ongoing protests highlight the fragile nature of India-Iran relations, where economic cooperation is often overshadowed by ideological and religious differences. 8. Kuwait. Kuwait has been another Gulf nation witnessing protests against India, largely due to rising concerns over Islamophobia. The outrage began in 2022 when inflammatory comments about Prophet Muhammad made by BJP members sparked protests across the Arab world. Since then, tensions have persisted, with periodic protests reigniting in response to reports of violence against Muslims in India. In 2025, demonstrations in Kuwait City have drawn thousands of people, demanding stronger action from the Indian government to protect minority rights. Many Kuwaitis, including religious scholars and political leaders, have spoken against India's treatment of Muslims, calling for diplomatic pressure and economic boycotts. Kuwait has a large Indian expatriate population, many of whom work in essential sectors like healthcare, construction, and domestic services. Despite the protests, economic ties remain strong, with India relying on Kuwaiti oil imports. However, Kuwaiti businesses have temporarily suspended imports of certain Indian goods as a form of protest. The Kuwaiti government has also warned India against policies that could strain their diplomatic relationship. The protests reflect a growing trend in the Gulf region, where India's domestic politics are increasingly influencing its foreign relations. While both nations benefit from mutual economic interests, continued protests indicate that religious tensions remain a sensitive issue in India-Kuwait relations. If India does not take significant steps to address these concerns, the diplomatic fallout could escalate, impacting trade and worker relations between the two nations. 7. Qatar. Qatar has been at the forefront of protests against India, mainly due to tensions over religious issues. The controversy began in 2022 when a spokesperson from India's ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, made derogatory remarks about Prophet Muhammad, sparking outrage across the Islamic world. Qatar was one of the first Gulf nations to summon the Indian ambassador and demand a formal apology. While India attempted damage control, the issue resurfaced in 2025 as reports of rising Islamophobia and anti-Muslim violence in India gained international attention. Protesters in Doha have gathered outside the Indian embassy, calling for greater accountability and action against those responsible for hate speech. Religious leaders and activists in Qatar continue to criticize India's domestic policies, particularly those targeting minorities. Beyond religious concerns, India and Qatar share strong economic ties, especially in energy trade. Qatar is one of India's largest suppliers of liquefied natural gas, LNG, making diplomatic stability essential for both countries. However, repeated protests and social media campaigns urging a boycott of Indian products have created diplomatic friction. Qatar's government has also expressed concerns over the treatment of Indian migrant workers in the country, adding another layer of tension. Despite these protests, India and Qatar continue to engage in high-level talks to maintain their economic partnership. However, the protests serve as a reminder of how religious and human rights issues can impact even the strongest trade relationships, putting long-term diplomatic ties between the two nations at risk. 6. Maldives. The Maldives has witnessed a surge in anti-India protests, primarily driven by the India Out movement. This campaign, led by opposition parties and nationalist groups, argues that India is interfering in Maldivian sovereignty, particularly through its military presence and infrastructure projects. The protests intensified after the new Maldivian government, under President Mohamed Muizzu, sought to reduce Indian influence and strengthen ties with China. Many Maldivians believe that India's military personnel stationed in the country pose a threat to their independence, leading to widespread calls for their removal. Demonstrators have taken to the streets in Malé and other cities, chanting slogans against Indian intervention. Social media campaigns have further amplified these concerns, with hashtags like #IndiaOut trending across Maldivian digital spaces. The controversy extends beyond military presence, as many Maldivians also view India's dominance in trade and investment as an economic stranglehold. In response, the Indian government has tried to counter the narrative by highlighting its contributions to Maldivian development, including healthcare and education aid. However, the opposition continues to fuel resentment, accusing India of using soft power tactics to maintain control over the island nation. As tensions persist, diplomatic relations between India and the Maldives remain strained, with both nations struggling to find common ground. The protests reflect broader regional concerns about India's growing influence in the Indian Ocean, and as long as Maldivian nationalists view India as a threat, the demonstrations against its presence are unlikely to subside in 2025. 5. Pakistan. Pakistan has a long history of hostility with India, and protests against Indian policies are a common occurrence. In 2025, fresh waves of demonstrations erupted on August 5, the anniversary of India's revocation of Article 370, which removed the special status of Jammu and Kashmir. The move, enacted in 2019, has remained a significant point of contention between the two nuclear-armed neighbors. Protesters in Pakistan have gathered outside the Indian High Commission, demanding international intervention to restore Kashmir's autonomy. Some protests have also been fueled by India's increasing defense collaborations with Western nations, which Pakistan views as a security threat. In addition, economic struggles in Pakistan have led to accusations that India is trying to isolate the country diplomatically and economically. Religious groups, political parties, and human rights organizations continue to rally against India, portraying it as an aggressor in the region. Despite diplomatic talks and back-channel negotiations, tensions remain high, with cross-border skirmishes and proxy conflicts fueling further unrest. 4. Bangladesh. Relations between India and Bangladesh have become increasingly complex following the political upheaval in Dhaka. After Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's government was overthrown, protests erupted against India, with accusations that it had meddled in Bangladeshi politics. Many opposition groups believe India played a role in propping up Hasina's government due to its strategic interests, including trade, water-sharing agreements, and regional security. Anti-India sentiment has intensified, with protesters targeting Indian-owned businesses and diplomatic missions. Some groups claim that India exploited Bangladesh's resources and manipulated its leadership to serve its interests, leading to growing resentment. The Bulldozer March, in 2025, a massive protest movement, saw thousands rally against Indian influence in Bangladesh's domestic affairs. Despite deep economic ties and a historically close relationship, this wave of nationalism has made it difficult for India to maintain its traditional stronghold in Bangladesh. With a new government in power, there is uncertainty about future bilateral relations, and protests against India continue to highlight growing dissatisfaction among the Bangladeshi people. 3. Australia. Australia has witnessed growing protests against India, particularly within the Sikh and Tamil expatriate communities. The issue escalated after allegations surfaced that Indian intelligence agencies were monitoring and intimidating Sikh activists advocating for an independent Khalistan. Reports of threats against Sikh leaders in Australia have fueled concerns of foreign interference, leading to increased diplomatic pressure. In addition, tensions have risen over India's perceived influence in Australia's domestic politics, with accusations that pro-India lobbying groups are attempting to suppress dissenting voices. The India Out movement, initially prominent in the Maldives, has gained some traction in Australian circles that oppose India's regional influence. Protests have taken place outside the Indian High Commission, with demonstrators demanding accountability for alleged human rights violations in India, particularly concerning religious minorities and political dissenters. Australia's government has maintained a delicate balance, seeking to strengthen economic and security ties with India while addressing concerns about interference. However, the protests reflect deeper anxieties about India's growing assertiveness on the global stage and its impact on diaspora communities abroad. 2. United States. The U.S.-India relationship has come under scrutiny following reports of Indian involvement in an alleged assassination plot targeting Sikh activists on American soil. The FBI warned a U.S. citizen of Indian origin about a possible threat to their life, linking it to Indian intelligence agencies. This revelation led to protests in major U.S. cities, particularly among the Sikh and human rights communities. The Biden administration has reportedly raised concerns with Indian officials, emphasizing the need for accountability. The case has drawn parallels with similar incidents in Canada and the UK, suggesting a broader pattern of transnational repression. Despite these tensions, India remains a key strategic ally for the U.S. in countering China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. However, the controversy has sparked debates in Congress about human rights violations under Prime Minister Modi's government, with some lawmakers calling for sanctions or diplomatic actions. Indian officials have dismissed the allegations as propaganda, but the issue has added friction to an otherwise strong bilateral relationship. The protests in the U.S. reflect concerns over India's domestic policies and its alleged interference in foreign affairs. 1. Canada. India's relationship with Canada has deteriorated significantly, primarily due to allegations that India was involved in the assassination of Sikh separatist leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar in British Columbia in 2023. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau publicly accused Indian agents of orchestrating the killing, leading to diplomatic expulsions on both sides. The incident worsened Indo-Canadian ties, with Canada halting trade negotiations and suspending visas for Indian nationals for several months. The Sikh community in Canada, one of the largest outside India, has been vocal in its demands for justice, fueling further protests against India. These events have led to widespread demonstrations across Canadian cities, with activists calling for diplomatic actions against India. The Indian government has denied any involvement in Nijjar's killing and has criticized Canada for allegedly harboring pro-Khalistan extremists. The rift has expanded beyond bilateral tensions, with the U.S. and other allies expressing concerns about India's role in transnational repression. Despite efforts to mend ties, the relationship remains strained in 2025, with ongoing protests and diplomatic standoffs.